Your soulmate left you one final letter. What it says will break your heart. My beloved child. There is a letter waiting in the silence between you and the person you still think about when nobody is watching. It wasn't written casually. It wasn't written during an ordinary moment. Your soulmate wrote it after realizing there might be no other way to say what they had been carrying inside. And the most painful part is this: they almost never gave it to you. They folded the pages, held them close, and convinced themselves that walking away would be easier than telling you the truth. But something changed at the very last moment. Before they left, they made sure those words would eventually reach you. Don't skip this, because the first few lines may explain something you've been unable to understand for a long time. They may explain why they became distant, why their energy suddenly changed, and why they seemed to disappear just when you needed answers most. But the sentence they wrote near the end of the letter is the one that changes everything. The letter begins with an apology, but not the kind you expected. They aren't apologizing for loving you. They're apologizing for pretending they didn't. They admit there were nights when they wanted to reach out, but fear stopped their hand from touching your name. They admit they watched opportunities pass because they were terrified that one honest conversation would expose everything they had been hiding. And then comes a confession that feels almost impossible to read. They knew you were hurting, yet they convinced themselves that leaving you alone was somehow protecting you. That decision haunted them. Your soulmate left you one final letter. Every familiar place reminded them of what they had lost. My beloved child. They write about the moments there is a letter waiting in the silence they were actually overwhelmed with emotion. You still think about when nobody is watching. They write about words they wish they could take back. It wasn't written casually. But then the letter takes a darker during an ordinary moment, because they reveal your soulmate wrote it after realizing there might be no other way to say what they had been carrying inside. And what happened that night is something they never told you. And the most painful part is this: they almost never gave it to you, because the final page isn't a goodbye in the way you think it is. Held them close, and convinced themselves that walking away would so much easier than telling you the truth to lose you that they never prepared themselves for what losing you would actually feel like. Before they left, they made sure those words would eventually hearing from you. The strange silence that followed, because the first few realization that they had mistaken your patience for something that would last forever. Then they explain why they became afraid to say why their energy suddenly changed. If you're reading this, and why they finally understand what I should have told you when I still had the chance. But the sentence they wrote near the end of the letter is something else that changes something far more personal. The letter begins with an apology. They tell you the real reason they left, but not the kind you expected. And it has nothing to do with a lack of love. They aren't apologizing for loving you. In fact, the truth suggests the opposite. For pretending they didn't. They believed walking away would spare you from a future when they wanted to reach out, couldn't give you. But fear stopped their hand from touching your name. But now they know that silence caused a different kind of opportunities pass because they were terrified signing their name. Honest conversation would expose everything they had been hiding. One that could determine whether this story truly ends here. And then comes a confession that feels almost impossible to read. There's one line on the next page they knew you were hurting, the entire letter yet they convinced themselves that leaving you alone your soulmate was somehow protecting you. I thought leaving would make you forget me. That decision haunted them. Then, after every memory became handwriting, they add, I was wrong. Every familiar place reminded them of what they had lost. They kept expecting time to erase the memories. They write about the moments they acted cold when they were actually overwhelmed with emotion. They write about words they wish they could take back. But then the letter takes a darker nobody around to distract because they reveal there was one specific moment that made them realize they were simply becoming better at hiding how much they missed you. And what happened that night is something they never told you. But then comes the detail they never expected you to discover. Stay till the end, because the final page isn't a goodbye and they almost think it is. Your soulmate
they had already
writes that
decided
they
what
so
they
much
would
time
say,
preparing
where they would meet
to
you,
lose you,
and
that
even
they
how
never
they would
prepared
explain
themselves for
everything.
what losing you would actually
But
feel
something
like.
happened before they could
They
take that
described
final
the emptiness
step.
that appeared after they
And
stopped
according to
hearing
the
from
letter,
you,
that
strange
single moment
silence
changed
that
the
followed,
direction
and
of
the
everything.
painful realization that they
The
had mistaken
handwriting
your
becomes
patience for
messier
something
as
that
they
would last
describe
forever.
what happened next.
Then
They
they
say
write the
they
sentence
received
they had been
something that
afraid
made
to
them
say
believe
all
you had
along.
finally chosen
If you're
to
reading
move
this,
forward without
I finally understand what I should have
Maybe it
told
was
you
a
when I
message
still
they
had the chance.
misunderstood. And beneath that
Maybe
sentence,
it was something they
there is
saw
something
from a
else,
distance,
something far more
Maybe
personal.
it was simply the silence
They
between
tell you the
that
real
they
reason they
interpreted as an
left,
answer,
and it has nothing to do with
whatever
a lack
it
of
was.
love. They took it as proof
In
that
fact,
coming back
the truth
would only
suggests
reopen
the
your
opposite.
wounds. They
So they
believed
stayed
walking
away.
away would spare you from a
But they
future
admit
they were
something
afraid
that
may
they
hurt
couldn't give
even
you.
more. They secretly hoped
But
you
now
would be
they
the
know
one to
that
break the
silence
silence.
caused a different kind of heartbreak.
They wanted a sign that they were
And
still
before
welcome
signing
in your
their
world,
name,
but
they leave you
pride
one
and
final
fear
request,
kept them from asking
one
for
that could
it.
determine whether this story truly
And now,
ends here.
looking back, they
There's
realize
one line
they
on
were
the
waiting
next
for you
page
to
that
do
makes the
something they
entire
were too
letter
afraid
feel
to do
different.
themselves.
Your soulmate
Don't
writes,
skip, because
because
the
the
next
next
part
part
of
of
the
the
letter
letter
reveals what they were actually
Then,
afraid you
after
would
a
say
long
if they
pause
came
in
back.
the handwriting,
They
then
add,
the words
I was
become
wrong.
painfully honest.
They confess
Your
that they
soulmate
kept
writes
expecting
that they
time
weren't
to
afraid you
erase
had
the
stopped
memories,
loving them,
but instead,
ordinary
they were
moments
afraid you
kept
kept
bringing
bringing you back. Because if you
A
still
song,
loved them, they would have
a
to face
familiar
every
place,
mistake they had tried to bury.
a quiet evening when there was nobody
They would
around
have to look into
distract
your
them.
eyes and explain
They
why they
realized
disappeared
they weren't
instead of
moving
fighting
on.
for what
They were
mattered.
simply becoming better at
They would
hiding
have
how
to
much they
admit that
missed
some
you.
of their distance wasn't
But
because
then
they
comes
didn't
the
care.
detail they
It was
never
because they
expected
cared
you to
so much
discover.
that they didn't know how to handle
They
the
admit there was a
possibility of
moment
losing
when
you
they almost
forever.
returned.
And then, at the
They
bottom
had
of
already
the page,
decided what
they
they would
reveal
say,
something that
where they would
sounds
meet
almost
you,
like a warning,
and even how
there's
they would
something I
explain
never told
everything.
you about the day I left.
But something happened before
The
they could
sentence
take
ends
that
there.
final step.
No explanation.
And according to the letter,
that single
no
moment
details,
changed the direction of everything.
just a blank space
The
beneath
handwriting
it,
becomes
as if they
messier
needed time
as they
to find the
describe what
courage to
happened
continue.
next. But
They
on the
say they
following
received
page,
something
they
that
finally
made them believe
explain
you had
what
finally
happened that
chosen
day,
to move
and it
forward
may
without
completely
them.
change the way you remember
Maybe
your
it was a
last
message
goodbye.
they
misunderstood. The next page begins with
Maybe
a
it was
sentence
something
that makes
they saw
everything
from a
before it
distance.
feel incomplete. You
Maybe it
deserve
was
to know
simply
what
the
really
silence
happened
between
that
you
day
that
they interpreted as an
Your
answer.
soulmate explains that the day
Whatever
they
it
left,
was,
they had
they
already
took it as
made a
proof
decision
that
to
coming
come back
would
to you.
only reopen your wounds. They were carrying everything
So they stayed
had been
away.
too afraid to say,
But they admit
rehearsing the
something that may
conversation
hurt
in their
even
mind,
more,
imagining your
secretly hoped
reaction,
you would be the one
wondering
to
if
break
you
the
would forgive them.
silence.
But
They
just
wanted a
before they
sign that
reached
they were
out,
still
they
welcome
learned
in your
something
world,
that made them
but
stop.
pride
and fear kept them
They
from
believed
asking
you were
for it.
finally building a life without them.
And now,
and instead of
looking
asking
back,
you directly,
they realized they were
accepted
waiting for
their
you to
worst
do something
assumption
they
as
were
the
too
truth.
afraid to do themselves. They tell you they stood
Don't
there
skip,
with your name
because
on their
the next
screen,
part of the
their
letter
finger
reveals
hovering
what they
over
were
the
actually
message
afraid you would
and then
say
they
if
put
they
the
came
phone
back.
away.
Then
That
the
was the
words
moment
become
they chose
painfully
silence.
honest.
Not
Your
because their
soulmate writes
feelings
that they weren't
disappeared,
afraid you had
but because
stopped
they
loving
convinced
them.
themselves that their presence
were
might
afraid
only
you
disturb
hadn't.
the peace you had fought so
Because
hard
if you
to
still
find.
loved them, they would have
But
to
then they
face every
confess
mistake
something
they had
even
tried
more
to bury.
painful. They say
They would
that
have to
after
look into
walking
your
away,
eyes and
they
explain
expected
why they
relief.
disappeared instead of fighting for what
Instead,
mattered.
they felt the weight of
They
your
would have
absence
to admit
almost
that
some of their
immediately.
distance wasn't because they
Every
didn't
day
care.
became an
It was
argument
because they
between
cared
what they
so
told
much that they
themselves
didn't
and
know
what
how
their
to
heart
handle the
refused to
possibility
accept.
of losing you forever.
They tried to stay busy.
And then, at the bottom of
They
the
tried
page,
meeting new
they
people.
reveal something that sounds almost
They tried
like a
convincing
warning.
themselves
There's something
that what
I never
happened
told
between
you
you
about the
belonged
day
in
I
the
left.
past.
The
Yet
sentence
whenever
ends
something
there.
beautiful happened,
No
their first
explanation
instinct was still to tell you.
No details.
That realization terrified
Just a blank
them,
space beneath it,
because
as
it
if
meant
they
they
needed
hadn't
time
simply
to
lost
find the
a
courage to
relationship.
continue. But on
They
the
had lost
following
the person
page,
they
they
naturally
finally
wanted
explain
beside
what
them
happened
when life
that day,
happened.
and it may completely
And there's
change
one
the way
memory
you
they
remember
mention
your last
specifically.
goodbye.
The last time they
The
heard
next
your
page
voice
begins with a sentence that
they
makes
say they
everything
replayed
before
their
it feel
conversation
incomplete.
more times
You
than
deserve
you could
to know
imagine,
what really
searching
happened
for
that
the
day.
exact moment when everything
Your
went
soulmate
wrong.
explains that the day they
Then
left,
they admit
they had
finally
already made a
found
decision to come back to you.
It wasn't the argument.
They were carrying
It wasn't
everything
the
they had been
distance.
too afraid to say.
It was something
rehearsing
much
the conversation in their
something
mind,
they said casually
imagining
that
your
they now
reaction,
wish they could
wondering
erase.
if you would forgive them.
And this
But
is
just
where the letter
before they
becomes
reached
almost
out,
unbearable.
they learned
to
something
read.
that made them stop.
Your soulmate writes
They
that
believed
they
you
remember
were
looking
finally
at you and
building a
pretending
life
they were
without
stronger
them,
than
and
they
instead
really
of
were.
asking you directly,
They remember
accepted
acting
their
as though
worst
leaving
assumption
would be
as the
easy.
truth.
They remember
They
hiding
tell you
the
they
fear in
stood
their
there
voice
with your name
because
on
they
their
didn't
screen,
want you to know
their
how
finger
deeply
hovering
the
over the
goodbye was
message
affecting
button,
them.
and then they put the phone
Then
away.
comes the sentence that
That
explains
was the
why
moment
they've
they
carried
chose
this guilt for
silence.
so long.
I wanted
Not
you to
because
stop
their
me,
feelings
but I never
disappeared,
gave you a
but
reason
because they
to.
convinced themselves that their
They
presence
finally
might only
admit that
disturb
they
the
were
peace
waiting
you had
for
fought so
reassurance
hard to
while
find.
simultaneously pushing
But
you
then
away.
they confess something even
They
more
expected
painful.
you to understand feelings
They say
never
that after
expressed.
walking away, they expected
And now
relief.
they know that wasn't fair to you.
Instead,
But
they
the
felt
final
the weight of
lines
your
on this
absence
page
almost
reveal
immediately.
something even more unexpected.
Every day became an argument.
They say there was
between
one
what they
promise
told
they made to
themselves and what their
themselves
heart
after leaving,
refused to accept.
and they broke that promise recently.
They tried to stay busy.
They reached for your
They
name
tried
again.
meeting new people.
They almost sent the
They
message.
tried convincing themselves that what
Almost.
happened between you belonged in the past.
But before they could, they
Yet
discovered
whenever
something
that
beautiful
made them
happened.
realize the
Their
letter
first
had to be written
instinct was
first.
still to tell you.
And what they discovered may be
that
very
realization
reason these words are
terrified
reaching
them.
you now. Because it meant
What your
they hadn't
soulmate
simply
discovered
lost a
that day
relationship.
was not another person, and it
They
wasn't
had
the
lost
ending
the
they had
person they
imagined.
naturally wanted beside them.
It was
when life
something
happened.
about you.
And there's
They
one
realized
memory
you
they
had
mentioned
stopped waiting for an
specifically.
explanation.
The last time they heard your voice.
You were beginning to accept
They
that
say
some
they
doors
replayed
might
that
never
conversation
reopen,
more times
and that
than you could
realization
imagine,
shook them more
searching
than they
for the
expected.
exact moment when everything
For the
went
first
wrong.
time, they understood
Then
that
they
your
admit
silence
they finally
wasn't
found
punishment.
it.
It
wasn't
wasn't
the
the
argument. You had
It
spent
wasn't
so
the
long
distance.
trying to understand someone
It was
who
something
refused
much
to explain
smaller,
themselves.
something
that
they
eventually
said casually
you had to
that they
choose
now
your own
wish they
peace.
could erase.
Your soulmate admits
And this
that
is where the
seeing this
letter
forced
becomes
them to
almost
confront a truth
unbearable
they had
to read.
avoided. Your soulmate
They had been
writes that they
asking you to
remember
carry
looking
the
at you
emotional
and
weight
pretending
of a
they were
decision
stronger
they
than
made.
they really were.
And suddenly,
They remember
all those
acting as though
excuses
leaving
sounded
would
different.
be easy. The fear.
They remember hiding the fear
the
in
distance,
their voice because they didn't want you
the
to know how
unanswered
deeply
messages,
the goodbye was affecting them.
the moments when you wondered
Then
whether
comes
you
the
mattered.
sentence that explains why
They
they've
finally
carried
saw
this
the
guilt
damage
for so
from your
long.
side of the
I
story.
wanted you to stop me,
But
but
there
I
was
never
one
gave
thing
you a
they
reason
still
to.
couldn't bring themselves to say directly
They finally
to you.
admit that they were waiting
They
for
write
reassurance
that they had one
while
final
simultaneously
conversation
pushing
with
you
themselves
away.
before finishing the letter.
They expected you to understand
They
feelings
asked
they never
if I could go
expressed.
back, would I do anything
And now
differently?
they know that wasn't fair to
The
you.
answer came immediately.
But the final lines on this
They would
page
stay.
reveal something even more
They would
unexpected.
speak.
They
would
say there
stop
was one
pretending
promise
that being
they made to
vulnerable meant
themselves
being
after
weak.
leaving, and they broke
They
that
would tell
promise
you when they were
recently.
scared instead of
They
disappearing.
reached for your name again.
They would tell you when they missed
almost
you instead
sent
of
the
acting
message.
indifferent.
Almost.
And most importantly, they
But
would never
before they
make you
could,
question
they
whether you
discovered
were loved.
something that made them realize
But then
the letter
had to
takes
be written
another
first,
painful turn.
and what they discovered may be the very
Your
reason
soulmate
these
admits
words are
that
reaching
regret
you
alone
now.
doesn't give someone the
What
right
your
to return.
soulmate discovered that day was
They know
not
they
another
can't
person,
simply appear
and it
again
wasn't
and
the ending
expect
they
the
had
door
imagined.
to open.
It was
They know
something
you
about
may have
you.
changed.
They realized
They know
you
you
had
may
stopped
have learned
waiting
to
for
live
an
without
explanation.
them.
And for the first
You were
time,
beginning to
they
accept
aren't
that
asking
some
you
doors
to forget
might
what
never
happened,
reopen,
and that
They're
realization
asking you
shook
to
them more than
understand
they
why it
expected.
happened.
For the
Stay
first
till
time,
the end,
they understood
because the
that your
final
silence
request they
wasn't
wrote
punishment.
isn't what you would expect from
It
someone
was
desperate to
exhaustion.
come back.
You had spent so
Near
long
the
trying
bottom
to
of the
understand
page,
someone
the
who
handwriting
refused to
becomes
explain
smaller,
themselves,
almost
that
as though
eventually
every
you had
word
to
is
choose
becoming
your own
harder
peace.
to release.
Your
They
soulmate
write,
admits that
I don't
seeing
need you
this
to
forced
forgive
them
me
to confront
today.
a truth they had avoided.
Then comes a sentence that may hurt
They had
more
been
than the
asking you to
apology
carry
itself.
the emotional
I
weight
just
of a
need you to
decision
know
they
that
made.
you were never the problem.
And suddenly, All those
They
excuses
explained that when they
sounded
left,
different. They were fighting battles
fear,
inside themselves that they
the
didn't know how to
distance,
name, and instead of
the
letting you
unanswered
see their
messages,
fear, they made you believe
the
you were
moments
somehow
when you
not
wondered
enough.
whether you mattered.
They regret that
They
more than
finally
anything.
saw the damage from your side
But
of the
then
story.
they reveal why they're calling
But
this
there
their
was one
final
thing
letter.
they
still couldn't bring
They
themselves
say
to
they
say
refuse
directly
to
keep
you.
appearing in your life only
They
to
write that
disappear
they had
again.
one final conversation
If
with
they ever
themselves
return,
before finishing
they want
the
to
letter.
return differently. They asked,
With
if
honesty,
I could go back,
consistency,
would I do anything
and the
differently?
courage
they didn't have before.
The answer came immediately.
And just when you think the letter
They
is
would
ending,
stay.
there's one final
They would
page
speak.
folded behind it. They would stop
Your
pretending
soulmate
that
says
being
they
vulnerable
almost
meant
destroyed
being
that
weak. Page several times.
They
would tell you when they were
But they
scared
kept it
instead
because
of
it
disappearing.
contains
the one truth they were
They
never
would tell
brave
you when
enough
they
to
missed
tell
you
you
instead
instead
of
of
acting
acting
indifferent.
The final
And
page
most
feels
importantly,
different before
they
you
would
even
never
read
make
the
you
first
question whether
sentence.
you were loved.
There are
But
fewer
then the
words,
letter takes
more
another
empty
painful
space,
turn.
and several places where the
Your
ink appears
soulmate
darker,
admits that regret
as if your
alone
soulmate
doesn't give
stopped
someone the
writing
right
to
to
collect
return.
themselves. They know they
Then you
can't
see it.
simply appear
There is
again
one
and
truth
expect
I
the
need
door
you
to
to
carry
open.
with you, even if
They
you
know
never
you
speak
may
to
have
me
changed.
again. They
know
explain
you
that
may have
loving you
learned to
was
live
never the
without
mistake.
them.
And
The
for
mistake
the first
was
time,
believing they could
aren't
walk
asking
away
you
without
to forget what
consequences.
happens.
They
They're
thought
asking you to
distance would
understand
make the
why it
emotion
happened.
smaller.
But distance
Stay
only
till
made
the
the
end,
truth louder.
because the final request they wrote
They
isn't
remember
what you would
every
expect
time you
from
offered
someone desperate to
understanding
come
when they
back.
gave you uncertainty. Near the bottom
Every
of
time
the page,
you waited when
the
they gave you
handwriting
silence.
becomes smaller, almost as
Every
though
time
every
you
word
tried
is
to
becoming
believe there
harder
was
still
to
something
release.
worth saving. They write,
And
I
now
don't
they
need you to
understand
forgive
that
me
you weren't
today.
asking for perfection.
Then comes a sentence
You
that
were
may
asking
hurt more
for
than
honesty.
the apology itself.
I
That
just need you to
realization
know
breaks
that you
something
were never the
inside
problem.
them, because they know they could have
They
given you
explain
that
that when
much.
they left,
They were
then
fighting
comes a
battles
confession
inside
that
themselves
changes the
that they
meaning
didn't
of
know
the
how to
entire
name,
letter.
and instead of letting you see their
They
fear,
admit they
they
didn't
made you
leave
believe
because
you
they
were
stopped
somehow
loving
not
you.
enough. They left because they were
regret
terrified
that more
that they
than
would never
anything.
become the person you deserved.
But then
they reveal why they're calling
For a
this
moment,
their final
the letter
letter. Seems to become an apology.
They
They say they refuse to keep
But then
appearing
your
in your
soulmate
life
writes
only to
something much
disappear
deeper.
again. They
If
say
they
they
ever
spent
return,
months blaming
they want to return
circumstances,
differently.
timing, misunderstandings,
With honesty,
and everything
consistency,
outside themselves,
and the
courage they didn't have
Eventually,
before. They had to admit
and
the
just when you
hardest
think
truth.
the letter is
They were the
ending,
one who
there's
kept
one
choosing
final
fear.
page
folded behind it. They were the one who
Your
turned
soulmate
beautiful
says they almost
possibilities
destroyed
into
that
unanswered
page
several
questions.
times. They were
But
the
they
one who
kept it
kept
because
waiting
it
for the
contains the
perfect
one
moment
truth
instead
they were
of
never
realizing
brave
that
enough
love
to tell you
sometimes
face to
requires
face.
an imperfect,
The
courageous
final
decision.
page
feels different before you
And now
even
they're
read
not
the first
asking you to
sentence.
chase them.
There
They're
are
not
fewer
asking
words,
you to put your
more
life
empty
on
space, and several places
fact,
where the ink
they
appears
specifically
darker,
tell you
as
not
if your
to.
soulmate stopped writing
Please
to
don't
collect
stop
living
themselves.
because of me. They write.
Then
you see it. There is one truth
If your
I
heart
need
finds
you to carry
peace somewhere
with
I
you,
couldn't give
even
it,
if you never
don't feel
speak
guilty
to me
again.
for accepting it. They explain
That
that loving you
sentence
was
is
never the
painful
mistake
because
it sounds like surrender. The mistake was believing
But
they
then,
could walk away
beneath it,
without
they
consequences.
write
They write something that makes the entire
They
letter
thought
feel like a
distance would
final
make the
doorway
emotion
rather than a
smaller.
goodbye. But distance only made
The
the
last
truth
paragraph
begins with 4 words. They remember
But if you
every
still,
time you
and
offered
then there is a
understanding
long
when they
blank
gave you
space.
uncertainty. You can
Every
almost
time
imagine
you
waited
them putting
when they
the
gave
pen
you
down,
silence, wondering whether they should finish
Every
the
time you
sentence
tried
at
to
all.
believe
there was still something worth
Finally,
saving. They continue.
and now they understand
If
that
you
you
still
weren't
feel
asking for
something when you
perfection.
think of me, I need
You
you
were
to know
asking
that I
for
feel
honesty.
it too. That
They admit
realization
they don't know
breaks
what the
something
future will
inside
bring,
them, and
because
they
they
won't
know
make
they
promises
could have given
they
you
can't
that
keep.
much.
But
Then
then
comes
comes
a
a confession
confession
that
that
changes
if
the
life
meaning
ever
of the
gives them
entire
another
letter. Chance to stand in front of you.
They admit
they
they
won't
didn't
hide
leave
behind
because they
silence
stopped
again.
loving you.
They left
Then
because
comes
they
the
were
final
terrified
line,
that they would
the one
never
they say
become
they
the
were
person
most
you
afraid to
deserved.
write.
I didn't leave
For a
because
moment,
I wanted
the
a
letter
life
seems
without
to
you.
become an apology.
I left because
then
I was
your
afraid I
soulmate
would
writes
lose you
something
anyway.
much deeper.
And now I realize
They
that
say
running
they
from the
spent
pain
months
only
blaming
created the very
circumstances,
ending I was trying to
timing,
avoid. Misunderstandings,
The
and
signature
everything
is
outside
waiting
beneath those words. Eventually,
but there's something
written underneath
the hardest
name.
truth.
3 words
They were the
that
one
were added
kept
after the
choosing
letter
fear.
was supposedly finished. They were the one who
Those
turned
three
beautiful
words are almost
possibilities into
impossible to
unanswered
read
questions
because the ink is faint. But
they
when
were
you
the one who
finally
kept
make them
waiting
out,
for the
they
perfect
change the
moment
emotional
instead of
weight of
realizing
everything
that
that
love
came
sometimes
before.
requires an imperfect,
I still
courageous
remember.
decision. Your
And now
soulmate
they're not
explains
asking
that they
you to
couldn't bring
chase them.
themselves to write the obvious
They're not
words
asking you
because
to
those
put your
words
life
felt
on
too
hold.
small compared to everything
In
they
fact,
had carried.
they specifically tell you not
Instead,
to.
they wrote what they remembered.
Please don't stop living because
the
of
way
me,
you looked
they
at them
write.
when you were trying not to cry.
If your heart finds
The
peace
little
somewhere
things
I
you
couldn't
did
give
without
it,
realizing
don't feel
they
guilty
mattered.
for accepting it.
The conversations
That sentence
seemed
is
ordinary
painful
at the
because
time
it sounds
but became
like
precious
surrender.
after you were gone.
But then, beneath it,
They admit
write
that
something
memories
that makes
became
the
the place
entire
where
letter
they kept
feel like
meeting
a
you
final
when real
doorway
life
rather
gave them
than
a
no
goodbye.
opportunity. The last
But there's
paragraph
one memory
begins
they
with 4
deliberately
words,
saved for
but
the
if you
very
still,
end.
and then there is a long
It was the
blank
last
space.
moment when they knew,
You
without
can
any
almost
doubt,
imagine
that
them
you
putting
loved
the
them.
pen down, wondering
They
whether
say
they
they
should
didn't
finish the
understand its
sentence
importance
at all.
then.
Now
Finally,
they understand
they
it completely.
continue.
If
And
you
that
still feel
realization
something
is
when
what
you think of
finally
me,
forced them
I
to
need
write
you to
this
know
letter.
that I feel it too. Then comes the sentence
They admit
had
they don't know
apparently
what the
rewritten
future
several
will bring,
times, and they won't make promises they
I
can't
know
keep.
I hurt you.
But they do
No
promise
excuses
one thing.
follow it.
If life ever gives
No
them
attempt
another
to
chance
shift
to
the
stand
blame.
in front of you, they
Just
won't
a
hide
confession.
behind silence again. They acknowledge that
Then
some
comes the
wounds don't
final
disappear
line,
simply
the one
because
they say
someone
they were
finally
most afraid to
understands
write.
what they did
I
wrong.
didn't leave because I wanted
They
a life
know an
without
apology
you.
cannot return lost time.
I left because I was afraid
They know
I would
you may
lose
have
you
cried
anyway,
over questions
and now
they
I
should have
realize that
answered.
running from the pain only
And they know
created
that
the
by the
very
time
ending
they
I was
found
trying
the
to
courage to
avoid.
be honest, you
The
might already
signature
have
is
become
waiting
someone
beneath
who no
those
longer
words.
needs their explanation.
But there's something written underneath
that
the name.
possibility
3
scares
words
them,
that were
but
added
they
after
say
the
they're
letter
finally
was
willing to
supposedly
accept
finished.
it.
Because
Those
for
3
once,
words are
they
almost
don't want their
impossible
love
to
to
become
read
another
because the
burden
ink
you
is
have to
faint.
carry. But when you finally make
They
them
want
out,
you to be free
they
from
change
the
the emotional
uncertainty
weight
they
of everything
created.
that came before. But then, almost at the
I
very
still
bottom
remember.
of the page, they reveal
Your
why this
soulmate
letter was
explains
never
that they
meant to
couldn't
be
bring
simply
themselves
an
to
apology.
write the obvious words.
There is
because those
another
words
message
felt
hidden
too small
inside it.
compared to
One
everything
sentence
they had
say
carried.
you should read only if
Instead,
you're ready to hear the
they
truth.
wrote what they remembered.
And that
The way you
sentence
looked
is the
at
one
them
that
when you were
breaks the
trying
silence
not to
completely.
cry.
If I could choose
little
one
things
moment
you
to
did
return
without
to,
realizing
I wouldn't
they
choose the
mattered.
day we met. I
The
would choose the day
conversations
I
that
walked
seemed
away.
ordinary at the time but
They
became
explain
precious
that they
after
wouldn't
you were
return to
gone.
change the beginning. They admit
They
that
would
memories
return to
became
change
the place
the
where
ending
they
they
kept
created.
meeting you when real life
They
gave
would
them
turn
no
around.
opportunity. They would
But
tell
there's
you
one
the
memory
truth.
they deliberately saved
They would
for the
admit
very
they were
end.
scared instead of pretending
It was
they
the
didn't
last
care.
moment when they knew,
And
without
then they
any
write
doubt,
something that
you
feels
loved
almost
them.
like a final release.
They say they didn't understand its importance.
You were never
then.
meant to spend your life wondering
Now
why
they
I
understand
left.
it completely.
That was the closure
And that
they
realization
wanted you to
is
have.
what finally forced them
But
to
the letter
write this
doesn't
letter.
end there. Then comes
There is
the
a final
sentence they had
sentence
apparently
written beneath
rewritten
everything
several
else,
times, almost like an afterthought.
I know I hurt
It
you.
says, and if this
No
letter ever
excuses
finds you
follow
when
it.
you finally stopped waiting
No
for
attempt
me,
to shift
then
the
maybe
blame.
that's when you'll understand why
Just
I
a
had
confession.
to leave.
They
Those
acknowledge
words
that
raise
some
one last
wounds
question.
don't disappear
Why would
simply
they
because
believe
their
someone
absence
finally
was
understands
necessary.
what they did wrong? And what did
They
they
know
think
an
would
apology
happen after
cannot
you finally
return
let
lost
them go?
time.
The
They know
answer
you
is
may
hidden
have
in the
cried
reason
over
they never
questions
told
they
you
should have
before.
answered. Your
And they know
soulmate
that by
writes
the
that they
time they
believe they
found
had
the
become
courage
someone
to be
who could
honest,
only bring
you might
confusion
already
into
have
your
become
life.
someone who no longer needs
Every
their
time they
explanation.
tried to come closer, fear took
that
over.
possibility scares them.
Every time
they
you
say
offered
they're
them
finally
trust,
willing to
they
accept
found
it.
another reason to hold back.
Because for once, they don't want
They
their love to
convinced
become
themselves
another
that
burden
loving
you
you
have
from
to
a
carry.
distance was somehow kinder
They
than
want you
staying
to be
close
free
while
from
they were
the
still broken
uncertainty they
inside.
created.
But
Now
then,
they admit
almost
they
at the very
misunderstood
bottom
something
of the page,
important. They reveal why
they
this
thought
letter
they
was
needed
never
to
meant to
become
be
perfect
perfect
before
they
they
could deserve your love.
There is
When
another
what you
message
really
hidden
needed was
inside
honesty.
it.
One sentence they
That
say you should
realization
read
came
only if
too
you're
late.
ready to hear the truth. They say they watched you slowly
And that
become
sentence is
stronger,
the one one that breaks the silence and more completely. Independent. If I could choose one moment proud, to return to, they felt terrified. I wouldn't choose the day we met. I would because choose the day I walked away. You might no longer need the person they explained who once that they so wouldn't return to change the beginning. And that was when they understood the cruelest truth they created. They had spent so much time preparing to lose you that they never noticed you were already learning how to live without them. They would admit they were scared instead of pretending they didn't care. The next lines are almost a confession to the person they used to be. And then they write something that feels almost like a final release. They write that if you ever wondered whether you mattered, you should stop asking that question. You were never meant to spend your life wondering why I left. You mattered in ways they were too immature, the closure they wanted you to have, or too emotionally guarded to express. But the letter doesn't end there. There is a final sentence written beneath everything else, almost like an afterthought. It says, "And if this letter ever finds you when you've finally stopped waiting for me, then maybe that's when you'll understand why I had to leave." Those words raise one last question: why would they believe their absence was necessary? And what did they think would happen after you finally let them go? The answer is hidden in the reason they never told you before. Your soulmate writes that they believed they had become someone who could only bring confusion into your life. Every time they tried to come closer, fear took over. Every time you offered them trust, they found another reason to hold back. They convinced themselves that loving you from a distance was somehow kinder than staying close while they were still broken inside. But now they admit they misunderstood something important. They thought they needed to become perfect before they could deserve your love, when what you really needed was honesty. That realization came too late. They say they watched you slowly become stronger, calmer, and more independent, and instead of feeling proud, they felt terrified. Because your strength meant you might no longer need the person who once had so much power over your heart. And that was when they understood the cruelest truth of all: they had spent so much time preparing to lose you that they never noticed you were already learning how to live without them. The next lines are almost a confession to the person they used to be. They write that if you ever wondered whether you mattered, you should stop asking that question. You mattered in ways they were too immature, too frightened, or too emotionally guarded to express.